All right, hello and welcome. This is the Men of Color podcast. The Thrive Center. This is episode 5. Wow, we're on 5 already. Today we're going to be talking about relationships, friendships, right? We're specifically going to be talking about ideas of like fostering healthy and intimate friendships, particularly thinking about it in terms of as men of color and what that kind of means to us. But before we get into that, we'll do some quick, brief intros. I've been on podcasts a few times, but I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Brian Palomo. He, they pronouns. I am the senior coordinator or one of the coordinators. I'm a senior coordinator in the mentoring program in the Thrive Center. And I think what we'll have to do is just with the new year starting. Happy 2025, everybody.
Woo! Happy 2025.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, time is flying. Just one quick goal that you have going into the new year. So I think for me, it's kind of an overarching thing, but just a big goal for me in 2025. It's a little selfish, but just like taking time to center myself much more. I guess gotten into the field that I'm in. I really like to give back, and I'm constantly doing a lot of different things. I want to like try to take like some time for me, like probably like a solo trip, for example. I think it's really, I guess would say, let's just say that to keep it like one good goal is like in 2025 I want to take a solo trip somewhere, just like myself, explore, do something really just like kind of for myself, you know. Sometimes we don't do enough. So
Any ideas where?
any ideas where? Not exactly. Maybe Mexico City.
Oh,
Maybe.
oh.
I really like it down there. So
I was supposed to go there earlier this year, but
make sure you make it. It's a beautiful place. So, you might want to introduce himself next.
I'll follow that actually because one of my goals, I am going to Mexico soon, so I'm trying to work on my Spanish. That's my goal for 2025. But my name is Jacob Shirley. I'm the senior coordinator for the New Start Summer Program. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm glad to be back on the podcast.
Yes, happy to have you back.
Go ahead, it's all yours.
So my name is Roman Orozco. I am a peer mentor here in the Thrive Center, he, him pronouns. And a goal I have for 2025 also might be a little selfish, but also professionally oriented. I guess it's 2 goals. I want to work at Pima Animal Care Center again. And by working there, I hope to find a dog. And because I've been looking for another dog. And I could probably look for one now, but I just want to ease myself into it again. I want to ease myself into the industry again.
I want a second dog, so I'll go with you.
Okay, well, we'll make it
hold me to that. Remind
make
me.
it a trip.
We'll go to back together.
A work trip.
Hi, I'm Sebastian Moscoso. I'm a peer mentor here. I'm a junior. One goal, it's a little selfish too, but I wanna run a marathon in 2025. I wanna
So
challenge
selfish.
like my body physically, see if I can do it. So I think it'll be fun.
More power to you.
I think it'll be
My
fun.
goal in 2025 is to not run a marathon. No, I'm just I do like to run. That 26 miles.
I know it's
is
very
daunting,
mentally
you know?
daunting. Yeah.
Maybe a half, maybe.
I'm gonna half more.
You might be able
See
to
how that
convince me.
goes.
They might be able to convince me to do that.
Maybe when I get close to double digits running, I'm just like, ooh,
Is it here?
Ouch.
So there's one in Mesa and there's one in Prescott. Or
The half
Prescott.
or the
So the March one is in Mesa. That's the
okay.
half, and then the full is in Prescott.
Maybe I'll do that. I'll probably change my mind. Thank you everyone for introducing. Thank you all for tuning in. So for episode 5, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking through healthy and intimate friendships, right? As men of color, it's an interesting conversation when we think about it seems kind of simple, right? Of a conversation of like friends, like everyone has friends, acquaintances, etc. But I think when I think about this, right, it's like particularly these ideas around intimacy, close friends, right, and really building those like relationships that have a lot of depth. And there's a lot of research and conversations, and it's something that I've thought about a lot around men having close friends, right, and really building those deep relationships. And it's also there's a lot of trends showing that it's getting even worse, right, in terms of like when we look into like millennials and now going into current generations. So I have a couple. Sorry, I don't have this memorized, but I found some things from this article that I think is a good like starting point of segue to kind of like why this idea came up to me, and there's some personal things that'll come up that we can talk about, and obviously learn from you as well. But there's this national study that I was reading an article about, and they were saying that the the percentage of men with at least 6 close friends fell by half since 1990. So it's 55% of men had at least 6 close friends in 1990. Obviously, close friend is like a little subjective, but nonetheless, this is like what's the word I'm looking for? Like
reported.
self-reported.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. And that fell to 27%, and the study was 2021, I think. So we can also talk through like maybe like COVID looked like with that as well too. But it also found that the percentage of men without any close friends jumped from 3% to 15%. So a 5-fold increase of men who said that they didn't have any close friends. And then it was even worse when it came to single men, where 1 in 5 American men who are unmarried and not in a romantic relationship report not having any close friends. So that's 20%. And they even say that men with like a couple close friends, right, are not in great shape. Americans with 1 close friend are not any less lonely or isolated than those without any close friends. And those with a couple of close confidants are not only modestly better off. For those with 3 or fewer close friends, loneliness and isolation are fairly common experiences. More than half say they have felt that way at least once in the past 7 days. And kind of like piggybacking off of that, it's like not only is there like the talk of there you having like smaller friendship circles, it's really there's a lot of pieces within that around feeling less emotionally connected to the friends that they have, right? And not really having those like deeper kind of bonds and relate like in comparison to women reported having much higher rates of emotional engagement and support from their friends and that like level of like emotional kind of intimacy and that emotional support. And they say that if you're having that, actually leads you then to be much less likely to report like feeling very anxious or lonely, etc. So I thought all that was like really fascinating because I've been reading like articles the last few years and having conversations with friends, and it really got me thinking like about like my experiences when I was in college. Started talking to some friends about it. Also like even in terms of like my father or like just men in my family and how they kind of like embodied a lot of that. Because really a lot of that kind of hit home for me in different ways, which I'll get into. You know, I've been talking for a while, so I'll give y'all some space. But yeah, that kind of like was part of the background of what really brought this up for me. I thought it was important, especially with the podcast for like men of color in college. It's a very pivotal point in life, right? And like in terms of like trying to build those relationships and finding those bonds, you know. So I figured we'd start. Anyone who feels welcome to start to really just start thinking back to, you know, for some of us, I guess it's a little more recent, but like when we first started, got to college, right, and trying to build a community, make friends, just in general, thinking back, like how easy was it for you to be able to connect, like particularly with other men of color, and just thinking back on that experience, like what was that like? We can just kind of like start there. So we have some thoughts.
I mean, I can go because I think for me it's still a recent thing, and I think that I'm still trying to navigate it now. Just being in the second year of doing all of this, right, and trying to like figure out what is a close friend in this environment, right? Because like you said, it is very subjective and a lot of things, and I'm sure maybe we'll get into them. Have kind of changed my meaning of what a close friend is over the past like year, especially over the past year. Like that definition for me has personally changed, and I think for me, I think a lot of a lot of the people I would consider friends now I met through common bonds, I guess, and common bonds of not just, oh hey, we're the same major, oh hey, we're the same academic interest or like in the ballpark, right? I think for me it was just more about, yeah, like we have this shared experience together, let's share more, right? Like and I think that's where a lot of them, like a lot of my friendships now kind of stem from. And it's kind of difficult, especially as like, I guess, being more masculine, right? Like getting also other people who are more masculine to kind of express oddly, the things that they enjoy, you know, which can be kind of really hard to build a bond around if like they feel like they have to be locked into a certain the norm of for men, which I'm sure we will get into.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like more negative. Like it seems like a lot of people like you kind of have to part that negativity nowadays.
Like the negativity, like in terms of just how they feel about
Yeah.
sharing that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Kind of to piggyback off what Roman said a little bit, like Making friends in college, yeah, it's great to like make friends with your people that have your major, but that's not something you can like consider as like a close friend. I think close friends, you share the same values as. I don't know if anyone would agree with that. You should share the same values and same morals. And yeah, it's a plus that they're in your major, but I think on a deeper level, and that's I think that's where the problem comes in, trying to dig into that deeper level into them and trying to see like, oh, what who are they when they're vulnerable a little bit, like how can I build this relationship when they're vulnerable with me, and kind of you have to be very sensitive when you're navigating that area when they're vulnerable with you, and kind of dig a little deeper and like just share common experiences and common values that you have with them.
Any thoughts, Jacob?
I think it took me a while. My first year, it took me a while to find the people that I would consider close friends. But I found a lot of the people that I still talk to today and that ended up becoming close friends through a job that I had actually on campus. I was working for the Office of Admissions, and so we did a lot of recruitment. And back then, there was a whole unit of that centered on trying to find like low-income students of color, and make sure that they knew about the opportunities that existed at the U of A. And so, and that way we knew that we shared a lot of the same values. But I think it took a while to get from the place of like the micro interactions, like what did you have for lunch today? Because we saw each other every day, right? To getting to the place where we could open up a little bit more and talk about like what are your dreams in life, like what are the bigger things, like how can I show up for you and how can we care about the big stuff too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm trying to think back to when I got to college too, and even in like high school, I feel like it wasn't necessarily hard to meet people. It was just kind of in terms of like that depth. Just I feel like a lot of people that I knew, I would see around campus, and I knew them because like we would play basketball together, or like I had a group of guys that we'd go and watch like Champions League in the morning together. Or I guess there it was like lunchtime. Whatever. Point being, right? It was like very centered around that, and then even when we saw each other, we would then just like maybe talk about soccer, football, whatever you want to call it, and things like that. And it was really like that's kind of like what things were really centered on. It took, I think, the people that I got the closest with were some people that I had in my dorm, who I just kind of like by happen chance I was able to connect with, and then I ended up living with them the next couple of years. And yeah, it was definitely like easier to connect with them for sure. And we like actually like took time to like have you know strong conversations, etc., and really got to know each other in that like level. But it is interesting that like now that I think back, that the handful of folks that I really felt that kind of deeper level of connection with, there were some that were men, but most of them, pretty much all of them, were not men of color, which is fascinating too. Like now that I think back on that as well, I hadn't really thought about it. It came up a little bit later, like through my fraternity. Like I joined a Latino fraternity in Lambda Theta Phi, and I met obviously a lot of men of color through that, and I've had some really strong relationships through there. But like generally speaking, when I first got to college, it was like very difficult to find like relationships with men of color that were beyond like let's go like
Yeah.
which is like it's really interesting. I don't know if y'all had different experiences, like if y'all came to college related to that, but like that's a big thing that pops into mind now that we're like I'm thinking about it. I don't think it's any fault of them, but it's just like
Exactly.
yeah.
I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think like with men in general, it's very hard to to kind of break that wall down to be vulnerable, but also men of color as well. I feel like that's another barrier you have to break to. I feel like maybe there might be some like taboo to be vulnerable, right? I feel like that's maybe a right thing to say, but I don't know if anyone had like a similar experience with that. Like Ryan said, struggling to kind of break that vulnerability walls with a man of color.
I think for me, something Brian mentioned that thinking about it now is also very relevant to me personally as well, is that the men who I have kind of built deeper bonds with are very masculine presenting, but they're not, they don't consider themselves men. And so it's very interesting. And I think also the few true connections I've had with fellow men on this campus haven't been men of color, which was very odd for me coming being from Tucson, right, and coming from the South Side, where the majority of who I grew up around with, right, were men of color. The majority of men were men of color. And so coming here and realizing that the bonds sort of aren't the same, it was kind of perplexing for me to realize why. And I feel like even now I'm still trying to like cut through the weeds of it all and see like how do you kind of get that same vulnerability, right?
Hmm.
That for me growing up, I didn't get to see. I got to see that vulnerability in very specific, different ways that
Mm.
the men in my life kind of allowed me, like in their own special ways, because everyone has their own different way of doing,
Mhm.
of showing emotion, right? And just coming here, it feels different. Yeah, it feels
Mhm.
different, which is interesting.
It is. Does anyone have anything to add before I think it's a good segue unless someone has something they wanted to add to the previous.
Yeah, I'll just say I think it took me a while to even get to that point where I felt comfortable sharing and kind of getting where having deeper conversations with people myself, right? Especially about like emotions and things like that, because I came from a family where like there was a lot of machismo, and so there wasn't a whole lot of like sharing wasn't really encouraged,
Yeah.
or feeling wasn't really encouraged, or expressing your feelings, right? And so I think it was back when we had like the New Start retreat. I worked for New Start going into my sophomore year, right? And there were a lot of, we hit a lot of like kind of heavier topics, and a lot of the trainings were encouraging us to get to know staff members and share. And I remember it took a while for me to feel like it wasn't a natural thing to do at the beginning, but I think a lot of the friendships that I still have today, it was because we were able to kind of break down that wall and start sharing as more of a normalized thing over time.
Yeah, I mean that's a related segue to what I was thinking because I just with y'all talking about kind of juxtaposing, your time in college versus before. It kind of got me thinking. One of the things that I was curious about, kind of talking through with folks, is just thinking about like role models in your life. Growing up, whether it's parents, older siblings, whoever it may be, but kind of like what did they really teach you? I guess, or what did you kind of absorb from that, I guess, observe and absorb related to like male friendships, or like maybe it was like how things that you were maybe deliberately or explicitly taught, or maybe how the men in your life handled their friendships. Because that was another thing that I was thinking about too, is like how much of the things are really like socialized, and it seems like a lot of it's connected to some of the previous things we talked about. Around like machismo and like very like patriarchal kind of like just expectations of men and being very like stern and stoic and things of that nature. But yeah, I guess do we have, what kind of thoughts do we have around that? Like trying to think back of into our youth and as we're growing up, what were we kind of taught through our time?
I think for me, like Jacob, I also grew up in a big culture of machismo as well, with kind of the men in my life. Especially because back then it felt like definitely, at least my life specifically, felt more male dominated, and so there were those more those bigger influences in terms of masculinity and how to define it or what it even is. And I think for at least for what I've experienced, a lot of it was kind of you just got to know what it is, and if you don't know what it is, then something you got to learn what it is. And it always felt like there were kind of unspoken rules in a way that no one it's like you would have to figure out through a riddle. And I feel like especially my dad, kind of to your question, my dad kind of would kind of mention like, oh, you have to do this, this, and this, and it's like I was always like, I'm like one of those why kids. I was like, why, and it's always like he was always like, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way I do it. That's that's the way you gotta do it. And
Sounds
I think also too, I grew up with the big value of no one else is like I think this is probably one of the more problematic things I picked up is you kind of got to do everything by yourself.
That's a big one. That feels very connected to what we're talking about.
And
Yeah.
especially now, it's just not true because community is everything. At least my values now, I think community truly is everything. And I think looking back now on that, it was definitely, if I listened to that advice, I would not be the person I am today.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And follow up.
I know it doesn't like pertain to the question, but it kind of pertains to the community. What Roman said, it kind of struck a chord with me. I actually had a meeting today with my students, and we talked heavily about community and like building relationships, which is kind of funny. But like building relationships, like finding the community and then building relationships within that to like expand like who you are as a person, right? I think like building your community definitely grows you as a person. Oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh no.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah. Wait, go ahead, Brian. Let me think real quick. Or whoever wants to go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. No, you're good. Jay, do you have any thoughts related to growing up? Not to put you on the spot, but
Yeah, I guess I touched on it a little bit in the last episode, but there is a big culture of like what boys were allowed to do and what we weren't allowed to do, right? And so I grew up with a lot of like why don't you play sports and stuff, and so there was a lot of I wasn't being very authentic to myself when I grew up, and so I think a lot of the friendships that I made weren't that authentic either until I was able to open up more with who I was. So like I told Brian at one point, like my first year of college, like I would go to football games, and that was my way of like hanging out with people. But I don't like football. I can have fun at the games and watch the marching band and eat food and stuff, but I don't care about what's going on in the field. And so, and so it was like a lot of the friendships that I would, just like that was our core source of hanging out was like going to a football game, but we didn't get to like talk about anything like. A lot of that kind of fell away after a while, and so being able to embrace, like this is what I'm into, like I like to read and write and play video games and stuff, like that's, when you're more authentic to, what you like to do, then it empowers you to find those deeper friendships, I think.
And the football is an interesting thing too, because there's a lot of stuff on like I feel like a lot of things for it to be like manly, right? It's like violence, and
physical,
and there's a really funny Onion article. It was like a post, and it was like, oh man, what did it say? It was like man, how did it go? It was like men unsure if like making friends or experiencing harassment or something like that, because it was like it was like they were like pushing each other around, because like. I also read something else with someone where they said they went to like a softball game and they came back and they're like super sore and like presuming like you're playing with the ball, like why are you like but it's like, oh, that's just how men are. And it's like, what is that like? I don't know, it's just interesting, like you made me think of that, where it's like there's not really that encouragement for like like things are just kind of put into these like buckets, of like femininity versus masculinity, and like what's the like what men and boys are encouraged to do themselves, but then particularly with each other, right? And like what constitutes that, which I think is another segue to another thing that I was kind of curious to talk it through, right? Like when I in terms of the title for the podcast, right? Like I deliberately use the word intimate, right? Because there's a lot of connotation around that, right? Of what the idea of intimacy and what that looks like, and I was looking at the wrong camera, but and what that entails, right, or what that means, and there's a lot of like just like preconceived notions, especially when it comes to heterosexual men and having an intimate friendship. Like, what does that mean, right? And I think that's something that I kind of wanted to open up and start having like a conversation around when we talk about vulnerability, when we talk about intimacy. Like, what does that look like? And like, it can be relationships in general that we're talking through, like with friends that you have. Or that you like, or it could be specifically with friends that you have and like in your life, but just in general, like how would we define that? Like what does intimacy look like in a friendship like of two men? Right? Like what are examples, or how do we embody that?
I feel like it starts with having those people that you could say, how's your day going? And like they actually care about the answer, right? Because in our culture, like, how's your day going? Like, you just expect someone's like, I'm good, and we just move on, right? But like to be able to like hear somebody say like, how are things going? And it's like they actually want to know the answer to it. If it's not a good day, like they'll sit down and be like, they care
Yeah.
about that, right? They're not going to be uncomfortable with that. Like we genuinely want to know how things are going, and I think that's a good foundation for it. I feel like.
That's a good
I
one.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that like I feel like a lot of people, when you hear the word intimate, right, like they're not gonna immediately jump to that, right? Like we don't typically think about it, even just emotionally, right? Like typically when we think about intimacy, it immediately, I feel like a lot. I would some people feel differently, but I feel like a lot of minds immediately go to like the physical, right? Of when we think about that, but it's like intimacy is a encompassing term, and platonic intimacy is like very much a thing, right? We just kind of associate it with more like romantic or like sexual relationships. And I think that's part of like that taboo to break
Yeah.
around that too, because we kind of like attribute a lot of those things. But that's a really good, yeah. I mean, I've thought about that, but that wasn't like the first thing that necessarily popped into my head. But that's a good point. There's a very like the like what do they call it? Like small talk, like
Yeah.
like everybody's just like good.
Yeah. And then
Just
just
like
move on. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
I think just wanting to kind of similar to what Jacob said, right? To truly be interested in what the other person is saying. And I think through listening or being interested, right, like you can make each other better. And I think for me, a lot of at least going back to the question, right? I think being able to want to improve together, right, in a friendship way, right? Because I think you hear that and it's like you immediately jump to a relationship, intimate relationship between two people, right? And I think you can have a friendship and still want to improve each other, right? And I guess in a way for me now, especially being in solidarity with my fellow man of color, especially, I think I find that now I'm looking for more and I'm actively like searching for, being in solidarity with them and their causes. Listening to what they have to say, oh, you had a bad day, let's sit down, let's talk about it, right? So,
Yeah.
or you had a good day, let's sit down, let's talk
Tell
about
me
it,
all
right?
about it.
Because it doesn't always have to be bad.
Yeah, no, agreed 100%. Yeah, that's a good point. That's definitely something that I've thought about as well. And it's also like when I think about like the old saying where they say like good things take time or whatever, is that how they say it? Like that, like a big part of like an intimate relationship or and the emotional depth that you want to build, like that's something that takes like time, and that includes also, right, like I don't know if y'all have these experiences, but like for me, I have a lot of those friends that are like like we don't talk to each other for months or years on end, and then we like get together and it's like it's like we've been together the whole time, right? But it really isn't, right? Because like having the time and really being able to like, which I guess is another goal of mine this year. Now that I think about it too, it's like having more like regular check-ins to really be able to build that intimacy, right? Because like it's very easy to just get caught into the day-to-day and not take the time to like invest in that, like that's a big part of it too, investing time on top of like the actual like emotional and like investment that you have to have, right? It's also like putting the time in to like build that relationship. It's like very easy to be like, oh well,
Okay.
catch up when we do.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
There's always later, and then there
Exactly.
actually isn't. You
Yeah.
have to make time for
Yeah.
later.
And I think that's like, and there's actually like that same study was even saying some things around that same survey of like that's more common in like friendships with between men versus between women, of the like, oh, we every 2 years we get together and it's like whatever, but we're still part of my like close friends. And obviously there's like overlap because there's like neurodivergent aspects within that. There's lots of context that we can't ignore, but nonetheless it was shown to be related, at least. We don't know if causation versus correlation, I guess, necessarily, but there's something linked there. So, Sebastian, do you have anything to add related to intimacy and
I think
friendships?
when I think of like I guess intimacy and friendships, I think of acts of service for my friends. I think that's where kind of my mind goes. I remember like hearing like a podcast where two friends were talking, and it was like they were talking about their friendship, and they're like, hey, like I knew you were really my friend when if I was ever in a pickle, I knew like I'd call you first, and then the other person responded with, I'd be mad if you didn't. Right? That's like like you're there for them when they need you the most, right? And that's listening to them when they had a bad day, or like I have a flat tire right now. Can you meet me here? Or, I need my car done. Can you meet me here? So that's where kind of my mind goes when I think of like friendship intimacy. Like I think of acts of service.
Yeah.
For myself.
Well, that brings up a really interesting and a good point too, right? Of like how we think about like love or specifically love languages, right? Like that's another thing that will immediately go into like romantic type of relationships, right? As opposed to just in terms of our friendship, right? Like there's ways that our love languages show up in there, right? Of like acts of service or physical touch, right? Like hugging your bros, right? Like that's right. That is something that's taboo, right?
Yeah.
Like there's I know a lot of people who we're not about, I'm a hugger. I can't help it, It's just, obviously like ask for consent, right? Consent is important, but like if they're okay with it, hugs are great, right? I like physical touch, right? It's one of my love languages. And so I think it's like things like that of thinking about that and just that like, yeah, your bros, your homies deserve love too, Like there's lots of different ways that love shows up and is embodied beyond how just we typically think of it in like typical like romantic or sexual relationships. So I think it's a really good point to bring up. Yeah. Any other thoughts related to any of those questions before we kind of start to wrap up?
Just as my bros say, embrace the cringe. You gotta embrace the cringe sometimes.
Embrace the cringe. Yeah.
Which, sucks that I guess a lot of intimacy can be seen as cringe, but you gotta embrace it, right?
Yeah.
Just
it
like
can
embracing
be.
the love.
To kind of wrap up, I guess I kind of want to take some time for some like practical kind of like action steps, both in terms of like what you can do on an individual level, but then also like thinking about what are some things on campus or how we can help to like push back on this, right? Because all these things kind of tie back into, I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier, like there's the whole like male loneliness epidemic, right? And like it's a known thing that it seems to be harder for men, especially men of color, to really find spaces and people and groups to have that connection or vulnerability. So like what are some ways that help put yourself out there, right? Or things on campus. I think the first thing that I think of was Jacob like brought up, right? Like really thinking about what are the things that you're really like passionate about that you can then use to go find a space to connect with people authentically around. Like whether it's like writing is a great example, right? Because you can end up getting into a writing club or a reading group, right? And then maybe you're reading a book together and you can really tie that into like your connections to that and how that impacted you and different things, and really have like that way you're kind of like easing into having those like conversations, but you don't have to like necessarily dive all in. I think it's like easy for us to like especially when it comes to college clubs. I feel like we automatically, I don't know if y'all feel different, but I feel like we automatically think about going to things that will serve us in terms of like finding a job later or like different things, etc. Versus like I just need to connect with folks and putting myself in space to like really do that. But that's one thing that I for sure think about. So some thoughts, some words of wisdom for folks tuning in.
I like the club aspect that you brought up. I've definitely met a lot of friends through clubs, and that definitely goes back to like a shared interest, I guess, a major. But kind of, it wasn't only that, but we dove deeper into like, like where are you from? What's your past? Like, like and things like that instead of the how's your day? Simple stuff like that. But definitely encourage clubs in college because those connections, and I wouldn't say connections, those relationships that you build with others that have the same shared experience goes really far. I think
through more like cultural events, especially here on campus with the different cultural centers, I think being able to connect with your fellow people, right? Your group, right? And maybe finding people, because if you go to those events, you already know you're gonna have a few things in common, right? And so kind of just building upon that, and especially if there's like food involved, like talking about like oh yeah, like my mom used to make this way, right? Or you know, different kinds of things, whether it's cultural in terms of like socially cultural or culinarily cultural, if that's even a word.
It is now.
It is now. And so I guess just being, I guess in a way, cultural with your fellow people, right? And just being able to share that bond and then diving deeper, because I think that kind of opens up a lot of different ways you can go with someone, right? Like in terms of a lot of different conversations open up at that point, even if they're not of the same culture, of the same traditions, backgrounds. Just being able to kind of empathize and understand, you know.
Yeah.
Kind of the whole point of what we've been talking about today.
Totally. I think there's something to be said about sharing a meal with somebody. Like it's just always a great way to bond, right? Or even just like saying like, hey, let's go grab coffee or something. I think that can always start a really good thing. And I saw a meme at one point. It was like connecting tacos to the 5 love languages. So there's like, I love you as much as I love tacos. Like giving someone a hug, and it kind of looks like, you know, taco, or I don't know. There was one for, I can't remember all 5 of them, but
Look it up.
yeah.
Maybe Phoebe can post it up. We'll see. We'll see if we can find it. Yeah, it'll be somewhere around here. Yeah.
But I think like, especially anytime you share like a home cooked meal, or you know, something like that, I think opening up that door for conversation and for culture and for, you know, that shared experience, I think that's always really special.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think like when you start having these relationships and trying to build these like stronger relationships with your friends, right? Like it's okay to start small, right? Like this doesn't have to be like, because I know this is like there's a lot to unlearn, right? So it can be as simple as just, you know, if you're hanging out, you know, with one of your friends, with one of your bros, and like if you ask to have a conversation about each other's goals, I don't know, or like something, right? Like anything that can help to like open up a little bit more of those like conversations, and I think that's one thing that kind of helps, right? And versus like trying to go full in depth, but I do think it's important, yeah, so that we start having those conversations that go beyond the very like kind of surface level, right? That like tend to occur, that we all like, whether we like outwardly express it, we all crave in some way, you know. The other thing that I'll like definitely plug is I encourage everyone to talk to someone about, you know, really anything, even if you feel like you don't necessarily need it, right? Like whether it's connecting to CAPS, or we have the embedded counselors and all the cultural resource centers. Y'all might working through the CRCs, y'all might have even better like words to plug related to that. But it's like as simple as just starting to have a conversation. And some of them are also men of color, right? So they'll be happy to have convos as well. But I think that's always like a important and good starting point. I think anyone can use that space to be able to just, you know, authentically reflect and express themselves without fear of judgment, right? And it's not like it's just you having a conversation, and then it doesn't really need to go anywhere from there, and that might make it a little bit easier because it's much lower stakes than trying to like go do that with one of your like friends and like help you to kind of build towards that. So I definitely highly recommend meeting with some counseling as well. So, all right. Well, thanks y'all for tuning in. Make sure to lean into the cringe.
Yeah, embrace the cringe.
Embrace the
cringe.
cringe. Embrace. You can lean into it if you want to.
Yeah.
Your choice. But yeah, best of luck. Please, as always, feel free to connect with us in the Thrive Center. I highly encourage it. Actually, please come by. We're in the Bartlett Academic Success Center on the first floor. You'll see a desk up front. Pop in. You can ask for any of us. You ask for Jacob. You can ask for Roman. You can ask for Sebastian. You can ask for Ryan. You can even ask for Phoebe. Phoebe will be here as well. Phoebe's behind the camera, but doing an amazing job. Our amazing executive director, producer, whatever other titles, editor, cinematographer.
All the things.
So round of applause for Phoebe doing all this amazing work. Yes, future famous film person. Okay. Anyway, so thank you. We'll see you next month for episode 6. This was a great time, and yeah, see y'all soon. Bye.
Woohoo!